as we look at the feed value chain and we pursue efforts in the sustainability space for the feed sector, it's really important for us to recognize that feed can't act alone in this space. That feed as a sector encompasses more than just feed ingredients and feed milling. It also includes byproducts and co-products, for example, or feed and oil grain, feed grain and oilseed processing, which are used to make ingredients. But we also have influencers in this process. It's folks that are upstream of us in commodity production and crop inputs. And then it's all of our downstream customers and their customers, which are equally important to us in these discussions. And so we're going to have 3 webinars. This is the first of our summer series. We're engaging with folks who are up and downstream of the supply chain with us to gather information. And we're using that to set the background for our discussion. With that, I'd just like to say a big thank you to our sponsors for the summit, also helping us carry out these webinars today. And so we have our summit host, Christian Hansen, our showcasing sponsors for the summit, Bayer, Innovation Center for U.S. Dairy and Syngenta, and supporting sponsor, BASF. And with that, Courtney, I'm going to turn it over to you for you to introduce yourself and introduce our speakers for the day.
Thanks so much, Laura. And thank you all for joining us. I'm Courtney Hall. I'm the Director of Sustainable Protein Systems and Feed at the World Wildlife Fund US. Our team works with folks that have a stake in protein, whether that's companies that buy or sell meat and dairy products, or those that produce or feed animals. And we support a better understanding of the impacts and opportunities for more sustainable production and work to enable improvements throughout the value chain. So I'm just thrilled to be co-hosting the Feed Sustainability Summit with IFEEDER, and I've been looking forward to kicking off this, the first of our 3 webinars with this amazing panel lineup.
As many of you all know, this area, technically called IFEEDER, represents about 22% of global annual greenhouse gas emissions. That's a little chart showing you on the left-hand side what are all the different emission sources, and that blue wedge is from land use, IFEEDER, still at about 22% as of this year's latest IPCC data. And yet, we hadn't previously had a standard method for companies to be accounting for and setting targets for emissions in the land sector. And not just emissions, in fact, but emissions and also removals. So all of the things that you know well about, are thinking of, are included in this graphic here and are included in the target setting for FLAG under science-based targets. Storing carbon in soils and agricultural soils, accounting for emissions and reducing emissions from fertilizer use, from enteric fermentation, from on-farm machinery, and of course also in the forestry realm, accounting for carbon that's stored in trees, both the sequestration of carbon in trees and also the release of carbon at the time of harvest. So these are all of the kinds of emissions and removals that we account for under FLAG, so that companies can now set science-based targets and have a specific pathway that tells what should the mitigation be for emissions that are related to agriculture, land use, or forestry in this sector. Next slide. I just want to talk a little bit more in detail about what exactly that means at the end of the day for those who haven't already set a science-based targets. Under FLAG, we've created 2 different target setting tools, and this is something that anybody can look at. It'll be launched in the next month, and you can go onto the Science Based Targets Initiative website and see all of the FLAG materials, all of the underlying data. Everything is there. There are 2 main different tools, and these tools are for companies to be able to use in setting their science-based targets. So a company would come in and enter what are their emissions data and their removals data today, and the tool will tell them what kind of emissions do they need to have 5 or 10 years in the future? What kind of reductions do they need to have 5 or 10 years in the future to be in line with a science-based target for a 1.5-degree world? This tool, as I said, is freely available. All of the underlying data are available as well. In addition, of course, we've developed a guidance document and a detailed methods document, and these go alongside the tool to explain to companies or any interested stakeholder exactly what are the steps in the process for setting a science-based target for FLAG, who needs to set a target, which emissions need to be included, under which conditions are different mitigation options set forth.
Because as a food company, the base of our business is agriculture, right? Everything that we're producing and serving to our customers comes from agriculture. And we know that ag has always been one of the most risky activities that a person could engage in financially because of its reliance on nature throughout all of history. But it's now even more so because of the impacts of climate change and that we're already feeling, and we know that those impacts are just going to get worse. So the reason why I'm saying it's critical to our business is that addressing climate is critical just for the resiliency of our supply chain, just to be able to ensure that we can continue to serve the nearly 70 million customers that we serve a day. And we know that to Courtney's point, ag is a contributor to climate change, but we also know that it can be a solution. And these are all things that we want to be aware of, take responsibility for. The supply chain portion of our business makes up 3/4 of our carbon footprint. So if we're thinking about what is the impact that flag, what Krista was describing, what does that have for McDonald's? It's massive. And that's not unique to McDonald's, that's any food company. For any food company, the largest portion of our footprints are always going to be the supply chain portion. And again, it's about 3/4 for us. The importance for feed for us is pretty significant. And there are a couple things ultimately that we think we would need from the feed sector in order for us to be able to meet our target. And the first thing is what I think we actually need from everyone, not just the feed sector, but anyone that's in our supply chain, any other companies that are kind of companies that we would partner with that have similar targets to us, sorry. But also external parties like government. We think everyone needs this, and ultimately it's everyone understanding that we all have responsibility for this and everyone committing to partnering to creating solutions. Because we ultimately know that the solutions don't exist now, but we can create them and we have to work together to be able to do that. So that's the first thing we need for feed, but again, not unique to feed. There are 4 things that I think are unique to feed that we're seeing that will be necessary to help us meet our target. The first is around land use change. We need to make sure that any feed that's within our supply chain is being produced on land that is not newly converted land. So that grasslands remain grasslands, and that there isn't conversion of native grasslands, forests, et cetera, being converted to produce crops. So that first one is avoiding land use change to produce feed. The second is around production practices of feed. So really just making sure that as feed crops are produced, that climate smart practices are being used, like cover crops, minimum tillage, crop rotation, nitrogen optimization, et cetera. So that second one is around climate smart ag production practices. The third piece is around feed additives. So we see a big opportunity here for feed additives to be potential solutions for us. So an example here might be a feed additive that could be added at the feedlot that could help reduce the enteric fermentation of cattle. But also what we really need are creative solutions around potential additives at the grazing level, which we know is very challenging logistically, but since that's where cattle spend the majority of their time, that will be critical for us to try to find solutions for. So that third one was feed additives, and then I said there were 4. So the fourth one is around crop varieties, and we see a number of different things popping up around crop varieties that are important around feed. So the first is around new crop varieties that when used can require less inputs essentially. So if there are new varieties that require less fertilizer, then that can help reduce emissions coming from the feed sector. Another opportunity within crop varieties is around if new varieties can support animals to getting to weight more efficiently. That can be really important while maintaining the health and well-being of the animals. And the third is we think crop varieties can help, new crop varieties could potentially lead to reduce environmental impacts while the animal is consuming them. So for example, if there are new crop varieties that while the animal is consuming their feed, that maybe there's less enteric fermentation going on. And lastly, I'll just close that with all of these things will ultimately need data to flow around how much are these any of those four things being adopted, and can that flow through the supply chain so that we ultimately are aware of what's happening.
Is to establish people-driven sustainability targets. And those are what you can see before you on the screen today. Is we came up with four major targets. The carbon one specifically, reducing scope 1 and 2 emissions by 50% by 2030, is a science-based target that has been verified and approved by SBTi. And then the remainder were additional targets that we set among our employees. So that was the one critical piece to target setting for UDA, was making sure that we had buy-in and participation from our employees, because ultimately they have the power and influence that will affect the outcome of our target. And the second piece to our target setting journey was we wanted it to be data-driven. The biggest part of really establishing any target is capturing, aggregating, and presenting a good solid baseline. So we worked with third-party consultant Keiko Isom to make sure that we had a good baseline established, that all of the data that we were collecting was relevant and timely, and that it could ultimately be influenced and affected and also stretch us in a way. And then that carbon one in particular, that scope 3 also reduction, is highly influential by the feed industry. So feed accessibility, traceability, and innovations within the feed space will ultimately has the opportunity to drastically influence scope 3 reductions in any sort of way. So on this initial assessment, we scored a 58 out of 100, which puts us in the top 20% in the dairy industry. So we're super proud and excited about that. But what it does also is it gives us an idea of all of the things that we need to work on in order to be a more sustainable organization, and in turn allows us the benchmarks and items that we need in order to achieve our 2030 targets. So we have now a clear path in front of us of all of the internal things that we need to be working on in order to achieve our targets, achieve net zero in 2050, as the dairy industry has set.
We have our next summer sustainability series planned for Tuesday, August 16th at 2 p.m. This will be on LCAs. So should your product have one. So this is a nice segue from the end of this one on measurement and reporting and understanding your impact areas. So Laura Moody from IFEEDER will be the moderator, and then we'll have Tom Battleguys from BASF and Martin Guthrie from Darling Ingredients as panelists.